All right, lovers of liberty, we've got a special feature for you today, a complete session from Second Beast Rising, really a truncated course on constitutional freedom, a passion of mine going back 20 plus years, I guess post 9/11, going on 25 years now, human freedom, religious liberty. So we're going to dive deeply into that. And the full series of Second Beast Rising is viewable at beltoftruth.tv. You can use the login with the $7 donation or just request a free login for the entire seminar series, as well as all of our other stuff over there. And thank you for those of you guys who help keep this channel not riddled with ads interrupting the videos all the time. So the supporters of Belt of Truth Ministries, thank you. And everybody, whether you are or not, enjoy this video and fix our eyes on Jesus. God's methods of liberty reflect his character of love.
In Revelation 13, it describes two beasts, prophetically speaking, kingdoms. And in previous sessions of Second Beast Rising, we've seen exactly who and what modern institutions these beasts are pointing to. We're living the fulfillment of Bible prophecy right now. We identified the first beast as Papal Rome, the Vatican power, and the second beast as an apostate Protestant American nation gone rogue that speaks like a dragon, like the devil in the last days. Now, I know if that's the first time you've heard that, that sounds alarming, that sounds unbelievable, so be sure to study the previous sessions of Second Beast Rising, because the Bible is crystal clear on this. We don't need to resort to any speculation or guessing to come up with what the Bible is clearly telling us. It's not a human invention, it's a divine prophecy. And so, when you read in Revelation 13 the following words, that this second beast would cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark. We're reading about a time of immense persecution where every principle of freedom is relinquished. To paraphrase one of my favorite books on prophecy, every principle of a free constitutional republic will be relinquished. And the people will call for, and the elite establishment, the authoritarian state, will move forward with legislation like you've just heard here. Death decrees and no buy, no sell laws. The kinds of things out of the worst dystopic nightmare you can imagine. Now you might say, that sounds impossible, like some futuristic society, and we're never really going to get there. What you're going to see in this session, and a number of sessions subsequently in this volume of Second Beast Rising, is that this time is closer than we think. And we have to, in this session, to completely understand this prophecy, we have to know what those actual principles of freedom are. So we're going to go over 10. We're going to study in depth 7 of them, but I've got a list of 10 principles of a free constitutional republic, and I'm going to put those up on the screen in a moment. But before we do that, I want to be clear that as a teacher, I used to teach government, civics, American government. These are taken from the American constitutional system. There are a number of free societies in the world today, and you can structure a government any number of ways. But this is one of the ways that I believe God has really been involved with in the founding of this country, with the Declaration of Independence, acknowledging the Creator, and the United States Constitution safeguarding our God-given liberties and freedoms. You can't find a better set of founding documents than these. In fact, let me quote, these are the aspirations of every person, of every nation, tribe, people, and language who yearns for freedom. The Declaration of Independence says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And who can disagree with that? All men created equal. And yes, at the time of that writing, that hadn't been actualized. That hadn't been fulfilled yet. But the promise and the dream and the hope was penned in the Declaration of Independence. And subsequently, human freedom has advanced. But sadly, today, we're seeing freedom under attack in an unbelievable way that really shocks the senses and surprises people when they see it. And it's not just in this country, in the United States of America. It's perhaps where the viewer is viewing this from. It's a global phenomenon. Take a look at this chart. This is the last decade plus of countries who have found more freedom versus less. And you can see every year more countries are having less freedom than countries having more freedom. So this is a retreat of liberty in the world. But particularly in the United States, we're going to take a look at these 10 principles of our Constitution and our form of government where you have civic and religious freedom. But there's an amazing statement that really sums up the ideology of the elite today who don't view the Constitution and the principles of freedom as nearly as sacrosanct as they once were. Listen to this from Richard Posner, who's a judge, U.S. Court of Appeals, 7th Circuit, and he's a lecturer at the University Chicago School of Law. He said, on another note about academia and practical law, I see absolutely no value to a judge of spending decades, years, months, weeks, days, hours, minutes, or seconds studying the Constitution, the history of its enactments, its amendments, and its implementation. 18th century guys, however smart, could not foresee the culture, technology, etc. of the 21st century, which means that the original Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the post-Civil War amendments, including the 14th, which guarantees citizenship and freedom to all regardless of race, he says these things do not speak to today. Now that's an alarming and amazing statement for those who love their country, in my country, in the United States, where it's based upon this Constitution. This is the supreme law of the land, a legal contract that was enacted by the 13 colonies, the 13 states that formed the United States of America. And subsequently other states have become parties to this Constitution as well, this legal agreement and contract that we're going to get into in a moment to see what kind of freedoms that this enshrines in the law. But you see the mindset of those who are in the legal scholarly community today. There's no reason to study this. This is 18th century, antiquated, outmoded stuff. We don't need to be thinking about it because we live in a new world today. And so there you have it. Here's the 10, though. We're going to study a number of these. The first one, government of, by, and for the people, where you also see transparency in government. Now, we saw in another session called Put Not Your Trust in Princes, we saw that this one is already under attack. This is the idea where you don't have an elite group, an oligarchy, a power elite running the show from behind the shadows and behind the curtains of political power in the corridors of secrecy. Well, we are seeing that. So that one is under attack very much today. Number 2, limited government and the rule of law. We're going to look at these in this session. Property rights, federalism, checks and balances and separation of powers, a free press, the rights of the accused, privacy rights, where under that one we're going to look at the emerging surveillance society, which leads again into the cashless society control grid context that Revelation 13 speaks to. But really all of these are going to be relinquished in the last days. Now the last two, number 9 and number 10, we're going to save for another session, another couple of sessions, but the principles of religious liberty and the principles of freedom of speech. So precious to every human with a mind, with a heart, with a soul, with a desire to have their worldview and belief and freedom and to exercise their freedom. I really want to get into that now, but we'll save those two for another session. We're going to go through those other 7, number 2 through number 8 in this session. So I want to begin with limited government and the rule of law. Now we have to begin with the fact that in a fallen world, we need to have a civil government. You need the state, you need police force, you need law enforcement, because there are people running around who are stealing, killing, murdering, engaging in all sorts of aggression, theft, and you name it, assaults upon people's life, liberty, and property. You heard that in the Declaration of Independence. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution refers to life, liberty, and property, where Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence had referred to it as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But either way, the Declaration of Independence says that governments are instituted to secure these rights. It says, we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, and it names them, and it says, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted. Now, the Bible talks about this. Romans 13, this is where these guys got this from, right? The idea that you must have, in Romans 13, the civil magistrate, the authority that is of the civil government to enforce the law. This is how Paul puts it in Romans 13. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. And then jumping down, it says, if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. He is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So it's a good thing that we have, it's a sad thing that we have to, but it's a good thing that we have prisons, that we have law enforcement, that we have, instead of total bedlam and anarchy where everybody's running around taking advantage of others and life, liberty, and property are under threat constantly. Well, in a civil society, when you have law and order, you have to have the state. You have to have this institution. You have to have a use of force and coercive power in order to imprison, arrest those who would do others harm. So that's the first concept. But throughout history, more often than not, the king, the state, the oligarchy, the authoritarian governmental power itself becomes the greatest threat and danger to life, liberty, and property. It kills, it steals, it robs people of their God-given freedoms. So that's where the United States Constitution comes in, and it limits the exercise of the power of the state. We read in the Declaration of Independence that governments can become destructive to these ends, meaning the purpose for which they were instituted, to secure liberty. Instead of securing liberty, they become destructive unto liberty and life and so on. So that's why you've got to, as Thomas Jefferson said, bind them down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. In the United States Constitution, it's been formed as a republic, a constitutional republic, where rather than having the rule of man in the opinion of some arbitrary dictator ruling as he pleases, that would be rule of man, we have a system referred to as the rule of law, where the Constitution itself is the supreme law of the land. It governs the governors. It governs and places limitations on the exercise of the power of the state, so that you cannot get a all-powerful, totalitarian, authoritarian government that does whatever it pleases. Now, of course, that's one important concept, but also, you could have not just a king or a monarch or an oligarchy ruling in an arbitrary and authoritarian way, but you might also have a mob of people, the great mass, that might call for something that strips the minority of their freedom. And that would be pure mob rule, as it's been called. And so you want to restrain that as well, where you have representatives who govern on behalf of the people. So yes, it is a government of, by, and for the people, but it's not a pure democracy in the sense that whatever the majority says goes. You might say, well, isn't democracy a good thing? Well, of course, having a democratic elections and having the people have a say in their government is essential to keeping those representatives accountable to their boss, the Constitution, right? But here you have the people. If the majority were to get out of line, it would be like what Benjamin Franklin said. He said, pure democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. So you can get the idea that the 51% could completely take away the rights and the property of the other 49%. So you don't want mob rule. That's a rule of man system. It's just human beings saying this is what the mob says and we dictate it and we're going to do whatever we want. You don't have a monarchical form of government where you have an authoritarian individual or a group of people. So these rule of man systems are not best for securing freedom. A republic where the rule of law rather than the rule of man is the law of the land, that's what will secure liberty to the best of what you could have. Now, of course, that's going to mean that the people who are involved in the civic process, the government of, by, and for the people, as it says the first three words in the Constitution, we the people are establishing this government. So the people have to have some knowledge and understanding of the principles of freedom. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this session, because we all ought to be understanding and knowledgeable about what's in the Bill of Rights, in the United States at least, and the concepts and principles of freedom all around the globe. But that is not the case. The people are totally ignorant. They don't have this knowledge. There has been a massive dumbing down through the school system. Let me illustrate this with Mark Dice, the famous guy who goes on the streets and does these fake petitions. Take a look at what he gets people to agree with in this clip.
Wouldn't you agree that repealing the Bill of Rights is probably
That's
good...
ridiculous.
Oh, what do you mean?
That's preposterous.
I would like to thank you, bro. We're doing a social experiment. There's a camera over there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, these mindless ones all approved repealing the Bill of Rights for Hillary Clinton.
Are you kidding me?
Nope, not at all. They just mindlessly support their favorite politician. So this will help prevent the right-wingers from saying hateful things, repealing the First Amendment. You just repealed the First Amendment. Thank you. You friends of yours have been arrested before, right?
Yeah.
And so we don't need that pesky Seventh Amendment or even the Sixth Amendment anymore. Birth date too, please?
Oh, okay.
It's going to modernize the ancient legislation with
Repeal the Bill of Rights?
Yeah, Obama's going to replace it with the NDAA. He signed it on New Year's Eve. We want to.
No.
Well, I mean, it's
For
just.
the Constitution.
It's just.
Totally.
But that's an old
You're
document.
Crazy, and I won't even talk to you.
Hey,
It's an old document.
I want
Tear it up, throw it away.
I want to thank you. You're on a kind of candid camera type of bit. All of these people signed the petition to repeal the Bill of Rights. And as they were signing it, I kept repeating, this is repealing the Bill of Rights. We don't need the Bill of Rights anymore.
Really?
And it went right over their head. I don't know if they just don't know what repeal means.
No.
And it's just absolutely pathetic. So
Really?
thank you
You're welcome.
for being intelligent. I really appreciate
I took
it.
an oath to uphold and defend it.
Oh, you're military?
was.
Okay, thank you. By repealing the Second Amendment, what that'll do is we'll have a door-to-door gun confiscation against the white people, the right-wing extremists.
Okay.
Take away their guns. Then that way, only the unregistered guns will be out, and we'll be much safer that
Got
way.
you.
Thank
with
you.
that, man.
Thank you for supporting that.
No doubt.
To make sure that only the criminals have the guns and get them out of the hands of the law-abiding citizens.
Right.
If you have any problems, you can call the police. You don't need to defend your family yourself. So we're just repealing the Second Amendment. It's just a simple repeal of the Second Amendment, and we'll be terminating and executing all of the gun owners.
Okay.
Thank you. It's the Obama and the Bilderberg Group have their gun control agenda to just completely disarm the citizens, and we're just trying to help out and make sure and show that the citizens are behind being completely disarmed and put in a FEMA camp if they disagree. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate it, bro. And so we're trying to repeal the Third Amendment so the military folks can just pick any house that they want to stay at, and you'll have to quarter the troops.
And you can imagine in the last days, in the context of terrible disasters and natural disasters, diseases, pestilences, earthquakes, wars, and rumors of wars, and all of these things. You can imagine a people who don't have a knowledge and are not grounded in the principles of freedom, that they will be so quick to relinquish every principle of freedom because they have no idea. Now they're even willing to do it in a time of peace on a survey because some guy said, well, this is something that the president might want us to do. Wow. So there you have it. But there's some good news on this as well. There is an increasing distrust among the people in the power structures and the power elite, which is a healthy thing. You know, you don't necessarily want revolutionary strains where people are wanting to go and do crazy stuff. But here's a Gallup poll chart that shows over the past few years, there have been an increasing number of people who view federal government, Washington, D.C. power as a threat to freedom, as a threat to rights of ordinary citizens, up to half of the country, which is nearly a doubling versus where it was 10, 15 years ago. So to sum up, the rule of law, the United States Constitution, sets limits on the government's exercise of power so that they cannot do whatever they want and oppress the people. You've got families, individuals, businesses, churches, communities, by and large, left alone to operate, of course, within the law and have tremendous freedom. What a wonderful gift that is. And we're going to get more into the constitutional limitations on the power that emanates from Washington, D.C. in a moment. But as we transition from that, we're looking at a specific right in this section. This is the third of the 10 property rights. This is one of the reasons why the masses flocked to America in the centuries past when you had the New World opening up and people coming to this country. The primary reason and the greatest motive of all was to live in a land where you can worship according to the dictates of your own conscience as led by the Bible. Religious freedom, number one. But a lot of people also came, it was a land of opportunity, a land where you can keep the fruits of your labor. But you might say that is under attack as well, with increasing taxation and regulation and lots of intrusion in what was once a relatively free and open marketplace, even at the individual level. I found these we could go into a lot of economic philosophy, and we don't want to get too bogged down in that in this session, but just at the normal person's level, take a look at this news article. These are some examples of this being under attack. 15 million fine risked for garage sales. Yes, you read that right. New government policy imposes strict standards on garage sales nationwide. So if you're selling something that had a recall back a few years ago and you were unaware of that, well, they're really coming after individual garage sale owners. $15 million fines possibly. Okay, well, the normal buying and selling of human beings already becoming more and more regulated by the state, and so you see some extending beyond the limitations of power. And another example, an immigrant comes to the country, or you've got an immigrant community. I don't know if this lady was an immigrant, but she's in the midst of a Hispanic community of folks who do home cooking and they make their own things, and she's coming under the prying eye of the state here. Should a single mom be facing jail time for selling homemade food? California investigators recently completed an undercover sting operation into a community group using Facebook as a platform to exchange and sell homemade food items. According to the Washington Post, investigators tracked food sales through the group for over a year before carrying out the sting operation. Her name is Ruelas, and she now faces 4 misdemeanor counts for violating the California Retail Food Code by selling food without a license. Now, of course, a license, that would mean you've been given permission, a permit, as opposed to a right where you can just exercise your freedom without needing to get the say-so and the okay from the authorities. So a license or a permit is issued to allow somebody to do something that wouldn't be a normal human right. So what we're seeing here now is producing and selling food to your community and doing some canning and participating in these meetup groups and just what you say normal human behavior that the Amish come under persecution for as well at times and others. This is no longer a right but a privilege. It's moved from the rights of property category to this is merely a privilege. We will issue permits and licenses, and if you don't get one, you may not do it. So the default is you may not do it unless you receive the permit. So here under section 114395 of the code, each offense is a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine of up to $1,000 and up to 6 months in prison. So that's why the question was, should a single mom be facing jail time for selling homemade food? Now, speaking of property rights coming under fire, Nathan Adams was told by the city of Sugar Creek, Missouri, that he had 4 days to tear out his garden. or face a fine. Yes, you heard that right. Mr. Nathan Adams wanted to use his front yard in a way that was productive, getting his family out there in the garden. He said, I'd probably say 300 hours so far this year. I spend all my free time out here. I want my family to know where their food is coming from. I don't want to have to go to the grocery store and worry about what was done to the food. That's a smart guy right there. Growing your own organic food. You know, ideally, you're getting out into the country, you've got some acreage, you're able to really just live like kings, it says, in the last days in the country, right? Well, in this situation, this is an urban context, and this is a neighborhood, and some people don't like the looks of a garden in the front yard, and, well, there's supposed to be a lawn there. What are their vegetables doing growing there? Can't you do that in the backyard? Well, no, it's shady in the backyard. We've got the southern exposure with the sunlight there in the front yard, and the authorities were called in, and they said, you must tear up this garden. You are in violation of the law. So what was once sacred property rights, you know, doing something just wonderful and very human as growing a garden with your family. Even that can come under the investigatory eyes of the elite. Nearly 1 in 10 knows somebody who has had property seized without criminal charges, Reason.com reported. And what is that? That is called civil asset forfeiture. Basically, it means that when somebody is potentially under investigation for an accused or a supposed crime, their property can be seized before they are convicted or even before there is a trial. Now you might say, wait a minute, doesn't the Fifth Amendment say that you have your right to your property and it cannot be taken away without due process of the law? That is correct. But now we have civil asset forfeiture, and it's a mechanism by which police can seize assets and property from people based on suspicion of criminal activity that does not have to be proven. And the way that they do that is they say that the property itself was engaged in crime. And the property doesn't have to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The property itself doesn't have rights. Only the person has rights. So we aren't accusing and convicting the person of anything, but the property. We're calling it guilty of being an accessory in the crime, and we're going to seize it based upon that. Civil asset forfeiture. So there you have it. It can't be criminally charged. It's taken on a civil case, on the civil level, that it was involved in the crime. So Iowa seizes property from 1,000 people a year without proof of crime, says report. It's not just Iowa. This is happening all over the place. And you might say, well, this seems to be encroachments on freedoms of what we're seeing here with the garden and the making of homemade food and the civil asset forfeiture. Well, the mindset is, well, remember what the judge said earlier. He says the Constitution, I mean, that's irrelevant now. So the Fifth Amendment wouldn't need to apply if you're of that mindset. But also in the UK, I mean, this is global. This is not just the United States. The former Prime Minister David Cameron said, for far too long, we've been a passively tolerant society, saying to our citizens that as long as you obey the law, we will leave you alone. This government will conclusively turn the page on this failed approach. So he's saying it's a failed approach that we left people alone. We need to not be leaving law-abiding citizens alone. He says, we used to say, as long as you obey the law, you'll be left alone. You have freedom. He says, this is not the way we do it anymore. That is a failed approach, and we will turn the page on that. Speaking of turn the page, let's look at our next principle of the constitutional republic. This one is a special feature in the American system that is unique to the United States of America, because at our formation, there were 13 individual states, 13 former colonies of the British Empire, and they weren't united under one central government. And so they started to form what they called the Confederation under the Articles of Confederation. It was the first constitution of the United States of America. It was called the Articles of Confederation. So it was a loose alliance of the 13 states instead of having one singular unified state or government. Then they called a constitutional convention in 1787, and they said, hey, let's unite with a little bit stronger of a central government, but still with the states retaining most of their autonomy, so that we can have a stronger and more, just a better organized government where we can have one nation. And so they formed that under the United States Constitution, which was subsequently ratified after it was proposed in 1787. In the United States Constitution, as we mentioned under the second of the 10 principles, the rule of law and the limited government principle, the idea is here in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that there are specific and well-defined powers that can be exercised by the United States government. These are the Congress's legislative powers, and it's a list that's not exhaustive. You know, there's a limit to it. They can do this, and this, and they cannot legislate on anything and everything they want. They can't have a complete and totally powerful government that does whatever it wants, as we mentioned in the previous section there under limited government. But when we look at the issue of federalism, that's the one we're on right now. Federalism is an arrangement of civil government whereby the states retain a lot of the political power, and it's not all subsumed into the national government in Washington, D.C. So each state capital retains and reserves quite a bit of what would normally be civil, political, governmental functions. And so it's not all being suctioned up into one all-powerful, massive central state. And so the reason that the founding fathers of America did this is they wanted to divide the power. They wanted to diffuse the power. They didn't believe in concentration of power. They wanted it diffused out. We're going to see that in a moment also with separation of powers and checks and balances. But in this case, at the state level, the states are operating under their authority, and the federal government, in Washington, D.C., the national government, as you might call it, has its own jurisdiction as well. Article 1, Section 8 lists the powers that the national government may legislate on. The national government may not legislate on matters of freedom of conscience. It may not legislate on matters of regulating religion, and all of that. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, lists especially, it says really keep your hands off of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right there in the First Amendment. Keep your hands off of the Second Amendment, the individual's right to keep and bear arms. The Third Amendment, don't be quartering troops in people's houses. The Fourth Amendment, don't be doing searches and seizures without probable cause and a warrant, and on down, the first 10 amendments. Now, jump right down to the 10th Amendment, and we see that any power that has not been specifically delegated or granted to the federal government in Washington is reserved or retained by the states or the people. So in other words, the 10th Amendment says, Washington, you've got strict limits on what you may do. The states are where the main game is played in terms of political power and legislation and where most of it happens. And you might say, well, why do that? I mean, why not, for efficiency's sake, just have one supranational government that is this giant behemoth entity that does everything, and then everybody at the local level receives that? Well, you want more accountability was the mindset of the Founding Fathers, and the individual states didn't want to relinquish all of their autonomy, so in the Constitution they made sure to agree to have a Bill of Rights added as soon as that was ratified, after which that 10th Amendment would assure and make sure that Article 1, Section 8 was strictly limited to those lists, that list of what the federal government may do. The states are closer to the people. The legislatures and the governors of the states are closer to the people. There's more accountability. There's more we the people concept going on there instead of a distant government that's sort of having all of the secrecy and the things that we talked about before at the national level in this case. So that's federalism. But you see today that people that teach this. Now, I used to teach this in my government class just as a constitutional law teacher teaching about civics and American government. This is normal curriculum, right? Although from the national curriculum standards, you might not get such an emphasis here on the 10th Amendment. It's kind of glossed over, and they focus on other ideas that empower the national government. That's really the agenda and the push throughout history, is to increasingly concentrate that power at the national level in the hands of the executive branch. We're going to see that in just a moment. But if you are one of these people that is doing what you might call rejecting federal authority in favor of state or local authority, you might say, well, yeah, okay, that's pretty much what we just saw there in the 10th Amendment, that state and local authority, the people in the states, reserve all powers that haven't been specifically delegated to the federal government. So that's what the Constitution says. But interestingly, this quote I just read to you is from the right-wing extremism document put out by the Department of Homeland Security, and they're saying extremists or terrorists are people who believe this. So, I mean, what? That really took a double take when I first read that, because as a teacher, that's that I taught in my classes, and I'm teaching right now, but it's not an extremist statement at all. It's just a constitutional law statement. But they say, watch out for those people who want to retain state authority, because we want all of the authority in Washington, of course, is the idea, which prophecy says you're going to have this entity speaking like a dragon, and it's going to oppress the people, and it's going to obtain authoritarian power. Every principle of a constitutional republic will be relinquished. And that's a sad thing, but right now we've got it. Let's hang on to it. Checks and balances and separation of powers. In the United States, we have 3 branches of government. And again, this one can be set up differently in different countries, depending on the form of government. The most important thing is freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, not taking people's rights and property away. So there's different ways you can set these checks and balances up. But in my country specifically, there are 3 branches of government. They are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch, the Congress, writes the laws. The executive branch executes the laws, and the judicial branch judges on the disputes that arise under the laws and sometimes assesses the constitutionality of the laws that are passed by the Congress and signed by the president. Now, there are specific checks and balances in this context because you don't want to have one man who's judge, jury, and executioner, so to speak, right? You want to have this divided out. You don't want to have one person who's writing the law, signing the law, executing the law, and then assessing whether that law is fair and good and constitutional or not. Well, that's not going to be a very good system, a wise system to have. You want these separated out. You want power to be diffused. Separation of powers in these different places. Then if the people are involved and they're holding people accountable, and the states are involved in keeping the power at the local level, if you do this right, and it requires an informed and judicious citizenry, as Thomas Jefferson said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. But that's the system that was designed to take place. Now, unfortunately, the separation of powers and the checks and balances have begun to wear away. As we're seeing with every one of these principles, they're already being relinquished. So the checks and balances are supposed to be where, the judges can slap down the members of the executive branch and say, nope, you're violating the law, and that's not constitutional. The Congress can impeach the president. You can, if he's doing something that is not legal, constitutional, you can impeach and then remove from office. And of course, the judicial branch can rule Congress's laws unconstitutional. The president can say, that's not a good law. I'm not going to sign that into law. I'm going to veto that. So there's a whole bunch of different checks and balances built into this, where one checks the other, and you can use this human competitive element where one doesn't want the other one to necessarily hold sway, and it keeps everything under control in an ideal system where the people are involved and where this is being enforced properly. Unfortunately, we had in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century the emergence of what was called the imperial presidency. This is the number one area where the checks and balances and the separation of powers have broken down. The imperial presidency is a word that was coined during the 60s and 70s, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard Nixon era, where the powers of the president were really expanded. And rather than having wars declared by the Congress, you started having presidents engage in military action on their own or under United Nations auspices. You had presidents starting to say things like Richard Nixon said, well, if the president does it, that means it's not against the law. In other words, the president can do whatever he wants, right? No, that's called the imperial presidency. During the 1990s, with the Clinton administration, the concept of an executive order began to increase in its use. And you saw in a previous session a bunch of executive orders that were signed in the 80s and before and after. And so not all executive orders are for setting up a martial law scenario, but the concept of an executive order is where the president can just sign into law his own enactment. In the words of one Clinton administration advisor, stroke of the pen, instant law, kind of cool. So instead of the president, as the Constitution says, taking care to faithfully execute the laws that Congress writes, he can say, well, I'm going to write my own. Or in the case of what happened subsequently in the Bush administration, they would attach a signing statement to a law that was passed by Congress. And the signing statement would say, yes, we're signing this into law, but instead of faithfully executing the law, we're going to add this little statement that says, the president, under the authorization of the use of military force, has the powers of the commander-in-chief, and he can execute this law as he sees fit under the unitary executive theory. So if Congress says, please don't torture people under interrogations, they can say, yep, we'll go ahead and sign that. Fine print at the bottom. We may or may not follow this. There were some, legal scholars in the White House at the time that took a lot of heat for that. And then in 2008, you had a president running on, hey, we really don't want to have the executive branch so excessively powerful and so much secrecy and so on. And then you saw continued executive orders, and the Supreme Court even ruled one of President Obama's executive orders to be unconstitutional. So there's still a modicum of these things, these checks and balances still taking place. But Jonathan Turley was really the guy who blew the whistle probably the most strongly in the early years of the Obama administration. He's a Democrat and he's a liberal in his political views, but he's also a constitutional law professor and scholar, and he really does not appreciate the imperial presidency. Like anybody who studies the Constitution, you look at that and you're like, this is not how it's supposed to go. And so he came out with some strong critiques just from a neutral standpoint politically, in agreement with Obama's policies. But he's saying, you know what, the way that they're going about enacting these policies, which I agree with, is not constitutional. So as the Apostle Paul said in Romans 3, verse 8, he says, let us do evil that good may come. Well, no, that's not what we're supposed to do. You can't say the end justifies the means. We're going to take illegal or nefarious or otherwise evil means to reach a good end. That is not biblical, and it's not constitutional in this case either. Listen to Jonathan Turley.
In the Unresolved Problems segment tonight, New York Times reporter James Risen, who is facing jail time unless he reveals his sources to the feds, gave an interview to that newspaper over the weekend about the Justice Department's case against him. Quote, a lot of people still think this is some kind of game or signal or spin. They don't want to believe that Obama wants to crack down on the press and whistleblowers, but he does. He's the greatest enemy to press freedom in a generation. Risen, of course, is just one of many who thinks this president has been acting beyond the limits of his constitutional power. Joining us now from Washington with his opinion, George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley. Professor, thanks for joining us. Now, let me just start this with, you haven't always been on the side that says President Obama is exceeding his constitutional power. Is that right?
No, I voted for him the first time around. I'm from Chicago. In fact, the biggest disagreement I had with him was that he was a White Sox fan. It's gone downhill since then.
Okay, so now tell me what you perceive as exceeding his constitutional authority. Is it his constant use of the executive pen and cell phone, as he claims he can do at any time?
Well, President Obama certainly didn't create this problem. The problem of this rising uber presidency, this concentration of authority in the American presidency, has been going on for a number of years. It certainly was accelerating under Bush. But what has happened under President Obama is it's reached a critical tipping point. He has essentially become a government unto himself when he asserts these unilateral actions. I think what James Risen raises is a particularly serious problem. I agree with his assessment. President Obama has really launched a comprehensive attack on press freedom. It's not just the surveillance of reporters, but also the use of the Espionage Act. You know, he's used the Espionage Act against whistleblowers and reporters more than all of his predecessors combined. And I would never have imagined that to be the case. But all of this is creating a disturbing mosaic where this president is using executive power to a point that is almost Nixonian. In fact, I think he has surpassed Nixon in some respects. So,
Professor, so we talk a little bit about some of the things he's done. The executive pen, he's used it for recess appointments. He's also used it to change law. Obamacare law, I think he's changed some 30-something times. Those two examples, are there any other examples that you say he may be abusing or bypassing the Constitution?
Well, unfortunately, there's a great number of examples. You know, I testified a couple of times in Congress, and some of the examples people give, I think, are not violations of the Constitution. But I do believe that President Obama has repeatedly violated the Constitution, and specifically the separation of powers. Some of those changes to the ACA are good examples. One is that he moved $454 million from an appropriated purpose to a different purpose. And it really shows how Congress is losing control or losing authority within these branches. That's the power of the purse. And he showed that even that really doesn't restrain him. But if you look at areas from immigration to internet gambling to health care, you're seeing these unilateral actions occur.
Right.
And it's not enough for the president to say, I'm just getting beyond the gridlock, because what he's really saying is, I'm resolving differences with Congress on my own terms.
Now, Jonathan Turley, constitutional attorney and professor at George Washington University. Good to see you again, Professor. And so you have spoken out about this through President Bush's years and now through President Obama's years, and talked about the rise of an uber presidency. Is the president, in your view, about to violate the separation of powers if he goes ahead and does this?
Well, Megan, we're waiting for the details, but what I'm hearing certainly causes great concern that he will again violate the separation of powers. The Supreme Court has already ruled that this president has violated the separation of powers. It just took another case a week ago in the ACA Obamacare area about whether he had another violation in that area. And this certainly raises the same profile. The president's expressing frustration that Congress is not doing what he thinks Congress has to do. But of course, he's a different branch, and we have three branches in the system. And no president can take on the powers of all three branches, and that's what he seems to be doing. He certainly seems to be taking on legislative authority. He hasn't been particularly coy about this. You know, he says, this is what I wanted to get out of legislation, and I'm going to do it on my own. And that does become a government of one. What the president is suggesting is tearing at the very fabric of the Constitution. We have a separation of powers that gives us balance. And that doesn't protect the branches. It's not there to protect the executive branch or legislative branch. It's to protect liberty. It's to keep any branch from assuming so much control that they become a threat to liberty.
Right.
And I'm afraid that's... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
This isn't about how you feel about what should be done about the 11 million illegal immigrants living in this country. You can very much want a path to legalization for them. You could be behind the president's, original plan submitted to Congress that was passed by the Senate. What this is about is what a president gets to do when an elected branch says no to his agenda. And the framers decided that a long time ago.
Well, I think that's right. And I think what I tell a lot of my friends on the Democratic side is that we will rue the day that you helped create this uber presidency. It's been developing a long time, but is reaching a very dangerous point. This will not be our last president. And you may not agree with the next one. But what the Democrats are creating is something very, very dangerous. They're creating a president who can go it alone. And to go it alone is something that is the very danger that the framers sought to avoid in our Constitution.
Yeah, I said last night to Charles, I'm almost out of time. I've got to get this in quickly. To those who say many presidents have issued executive orders on immigration, none this sweeping, none near this sweeping, what say you?
Oh, this would be unprecedented, and I think it would be an unprecedented threat to the balance of powers within our system.
Professor Turley, the Constitution's system of separated powers is not simply about stopping one branch of government from usurping another. It's about protecting the liberty of Americans from the dangers of concentrated government power. How does the president's unilateral modification of acts of Congress affect both the balance of power between the political branches and the liberty interests of the American people?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The danger is quite severe. The problem with what the president is doing is that he's not simply posing a danger to the constitutional system. He's becoming the very danger the Constitution was designed to avoid. That is the concentration of power in branch. This Newtonian orbit that the three branches exist in is a delicate one, but it is designed to prevent this type of concentration. There's two trends going on which should be of equal concern to all members of Congress. One is we've had the radical expansion of presidential powers under both President Bush and President Obama. We have what many once called an imperial presidency model, of largely unchecked authority. And with that trend, we also have the continued rise of this fourth branch. We have agencies that are now quite large that issue regulations. The Supreme Court said recently that agencies could actually define their own or interpret their own jurisdiction.
Let's move on now to the free press. Now, I've got a whole lot to say on the media, the mainstream media, the entertainment media, the news media. I've got a whole series called Media on the Brain, and so I'm going to go through this very briefly and quickly because we're actually working on a Media on the Brain 2 right now. I'm not sure what the name is going to be. It might just be Media on the Brain 2. But the idea of having a free press is important in a free society. They call it the watchdog press. They are another check on excessive power or corruption or conspiracy in the government. Now, unfortunately, in modern times, the corporate press has gotten, so as they say, in bed with, they've formed an unholy alliance with, they've become yoked alongside the state itself. And so when you have one elite establishment, political and media together, then you don't get that check and balance up against the political power that you're supposed to have in a free society under the First Amendment with the free press. Now, it goes even beyond that, though. Beyond them sort of merging, you also see the state itself engaging in propaganda and news behavior, which has never been a feature of American society. But now the U.S. repeals propaganda ban, spreads government-made news to Americans. The NDAA legalizes the use of propaganda on the U.S. public. And again, we'll see a lot more on the manipulations of the media and how just this is probably one of the 10 that has fallen the worst. And so it deserves its own seminar session to further analyze the media. But you see there the legalization of government propaganda, where instead of having a free press, you've got state-controlled media and the corporate press, of course, with its own flaws. So choose your poison there. But let's go on to the rights of the accused. In a free society, you can't just be snatched and grabbed and locked up without a trial, without an accusation, without facing your accusers. There's a reference, a Latin term is called habeas corpus that appears in the United States Constitution. That's a common concept that human beings all have the right of habeas corpus, which means you can't just be imprisoned without charges. The Latin, the root of that is show me the body, produce the body, show, in other words, show the evidence that I've committed a crime. And then that would be presented before a jury of your peers in a speedy and public trial. And so all of these rights are found in the 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th Amendments. The right to not be tried twice for the same crime. The right to not have excessive fines and bails and cruel and unusual punishment. The right to have due process of the law convict you rightly and you are proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So all of those rights of the accused are very important. But you might remember in your recent history, after September 11, the American people were so fearful of terrorist attacks that they said, we will relinquish our liberty in exchange for security. We're not worried about freedom so much. We're interested in safety. Now, Benjamin Franklin said something very wise about that. He said, those who would be willing to give up liberty in exchange for security are not going to have either. So that's what happened. The government was able to just arbitrarily, according to their own opinion, just declare somebody to be an enemy combatant who was an American citizen and strip them of all their rights at that time after September 11. So they could be held without trial. They were just declared enemy combatants. And you might say, well, these are bad people. I mean, don't you trust them? And yes, of course, you'd never want to impugn the motives of any individual person and say, you know, I just know that person's out to get me. But as an institution, governments throughout history have not exactly proven themselves to be consistently trustworthy.
My understanding is that the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution specifies that you must have probable cause to be able to do a search that does not violate an American's right against unlawful searches and seizures.
Actually, the Fourth Amendment actually protects all of us against unreasonable search and seizure.
But
that's what it says.
The measure is probable cause, I believe.
The amendment says unreasonable search and seizure.
But does it not say probable?
No.
The court
amendment
standard,
says
the legal
unreasonable
standard,
search and seizure.
the legal standard is probable cause.
Just to be very clear, okay, and believe me, if there's any amendment to the Constitution that employees of the National Security Agency are familiar with, it's the Fourth, right? And it is a reasonableness standard in the Fourth Amendment.
To quote the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in its entirety, the one the General and the NSA folks are so familiar with and know is about reasonableness and not about probable cause, quote, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Well, maybe they have a different constitution over there at the NSA.
The Bible says, put not your trust in princes. So the principle of the Constitution is that you have an inherent and built-in mistrust in the abuse of power, the potential abuse of power that can take place when you simply grant to the state the authority to strip somebody of their citizenship at their whim and will, according to their own opinion, with no checks and balances, no judge, no jury. And it just happened that way after September 11. So there were people that were held in that manner. Today, there are similar things going on. The Guardian reported that police disappeared more than 7,000 people at an off-the-books interrogation warehouse in Chicago, where 2 people reportedly died while in custody, and it's totally in the shadows. Nobody knows who's in there. So the rights of the accused continually under threat, especially you just wait for that next terrorist attack, and we're going to have serious, serious problems. Privacy rights and surveillance society is our last one, and we're going to spend the rest of the time on that one. But before we get into that, remember from the previous session what candidate Donald Trump said regarding people of the Muslim religion. And in the context of terrorist attacks have taken place, you may need to look at a national database of all persons of a certain religion. You may need to have ID cards that identify their religion on them. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about in the context of increased terrorism, where the rights of the accused and freedoms in general are very much in danger as you move toward police state martial law scenarios, as we saw in that previous session. So use the time we have now and promote religious freedom, promote the principles of a constitutional republic and a limited government, and leaving people to exercise in their Christian schools, in their home schools, in their entrepreneurial endeavors, in their families, in their communities, and their churches. Freedom, while it lasts, enjoy it. There's a famous song that says, "Troublesome times are here, filling men's hearts with fear. Freedom we all hold dear, now is at stake." And that's the case right now. But the next line in the song, if you skip down a bit, it says, "Jesus is coming soon. Behold him, cling to that great hope." We'll see you next time.